How's it going, John? It's great to get you on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I've been probably since day one in security. I have been doing nothing but zero trust related work, and it's real fascinating to have you on finally.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to talk to you again, Joe.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you definitely provided some really valuable insights for my dissertation research that I actually over this past weekend, I'm like at the point where now it's like, okay, I have to fire up this model and let it learn and everything. And I'm just like, I'm nervous about it because I've never done something like this before, you know? And so it's like, oh God, this is going to take me forever to get done. And I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, but that's the fun part, right? I mean, what's the what's the deal with if you weren't trying something new and failing once in a while, right? You wouldn't do something amazing. I mean, I kind of think of Elon Musk and how his rockets blew up at first and everybody made fun of him. And now, I think it was last week, he had the second time that they caught a rocket in midair on the tower, right? There was never a time in NASA's history that they thought, "Oh, I'll bet we'll be able to catch a rocket in the tower, in the launch tower." They never thought that. They didn't have that much imagination. And he was willing to go through the failures because in NASA world, failure is not an option, which is a funny thing because I once did an event with Gene Kranz, the Apollo 13 flight commander who is
Wow.
quoted as saying that. And I also knew Jim Lovell a little bit too. And so, and I was talking to Kranz off stage, and he said, "I just said that to just encourage everybody and rev everybody up. Failure is not an option, but I thought we were going to fail. I didn't think we were bringing these guys home. I thought there was no way they were coming home. But just the pep talk and getting them in that mindset made them keep going, and not having that headspace of failure." And I
Yeah.
thought that was an interesting thing because a lot of people get in the headspace of failure. This is going to be too hard. I'm not going to do it right. And I don't know the famous story of how many times it took Thomas Edison to create a light bulb. You know, Too often we point at people's failures and we don't realize that they're learning from those failures, right?
Yeah.
Which is a segue into zero trust because there were a lot of failures early on in zero trust. And luckily, I was the only one making it. So I was able to take all those failures and then synthesize them and put them into a methodology that eliminated a lot of the things that I failed at. I mean, there was a lot of failures, right? But you didn't hear about them because A, I was doing it for people who didn't talk about it, and B, I wasn't publishing on the failures. I was learning from them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. And it's funny because I had to remind my brother of that exact point like this past weekend or maybe 2 weekends ago, but you have to like get into that mindset. And even when I was starting out, like I fell nonstop. I mean, it was widely known that like my troubleshooting guide at that company that I was working for was like the most robust document that they had for troubleshooting our application overall. Like the devs were referencing it even and everything like that. I would find error codes that they didn't even write. Like, it would give me an error and it would just be blank. And I'm sitting here like, guys, what is even going on? Like, I don't know. You have to write this. And they're like, we never even thought of that use case before. Like, let's go like figure this out. Right. It was always interesting when the dev would like that wrote the code would come over to my desk and he'd just be sitting there for like 3, 4 hours trying to figure it out. And everyone else is like, well, what'd you mess up, Joe? I'm like, I don't know. I hit install. Like, that's what I did,
Right,
like
right.
but that's how you learn best, like through that struggle. I got a very good understanding of, hey, we insert data into this Postgres database like this. And I didn't come from a computer science background. So it was a totally different thing. And oh, this is how the high availability pool works. This is what PG pool is doing, all that sort of stuff. Right? But if I wouldn't have been failing nonstop, I never would have had that like light bulb, so to speak, go off in my head as to like, oh, this is how all of this is tied together, and that's a huge benefit when you finally have that.
Yeah, I mean, people have to be allowed to fail. You want them to do it in a safe way, but they're going to fail, and we spend too much time blaming people for failures instead of going, "Wow, look, you exposed something that we never thought about before."
Yeah. So talk to me about, you getting started in the field. What was that like? Did you start with having an interest with computers and technology, or did you kind of find your way into it some, backwards way and here you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I always had a fascination with innovation and new things, right? So I'm old enough that I had the first Pong game, the very first one. You had to play it on a black and white TV because it would ruin your color TV. That's how old it was. I mean, this was in the early 70s, right? And then I got, involved in other things. I was in media, but I could see that the digital world was going to happen. So I put in my first network in 1984 because I bought the first Mac in Dallas, and I bought a laser printer from Apple, cost $7,000. And I did it to replace traditional typesetting in graphic design, because what people don't know is graphic design used to be a manual process where you cut out each letter and then you took a high resolution lithograph of it. And, it just was a very difficult thing. And so I got that to replace that. And so I had to network that. And from that, then I got into doing some animation projects. I went and did an animation project on the Cray XMP at, what was the company called? They did The Last Starfighter. If you ever saw The Last Starfighter, the first movie ever mostly done in CGI, but it was done on a Cray XMP, and I got to use that Cray XMP on a 3D animation project. And I fell in love with animation, but I realized, hey, I can't afford at the place I'm working a Cray XMP. So I had to learn how to build my own animation computers using AT&T TrueVision cards. AT&T was the leader in animation at that time. It cost $7,000 for this card that offloaded processing. It was really the first GPU, if you think about it. And then the funny thing is, we found that these computers ran Doom really, really well. I mean, Doom was amazing to play on an animation computer that had an AT&T TrueVision card. I don't know if you've ever played Doom or not, but we wanted. Then they came out with a way that it could network together and you could play against each other. And I convinced my boss that we needed an Ethernet network to move animation files around, which actually wasn't quite accurate because the animation files were too big to move across thicknet Ethernet at the time. But we could, when he was gone, play Network Doom. And that's how I learned networking, from Network Doom. So here's a trivia question for you. What's the port number for Doom? It's the only video game that has an assigned port number from ICANN.
Isn't it like 666 or something?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is
Yeah.
666. Yes. So a lot of, I was talking to an old school Cisco guy, and he was saying there were so many innovations that came out of people playing, in these IT departments, playing Network Doom in the evenings. They had to create code in iOS, Internet Operating System, in Cisco routers and switches to support that, right? And so, you could make a case, a really interesting case, that a lot of IT was um, driven by computer graphics per se, but video games. So I'll just bring this out. One of my prized possessions, the first NVIDIA Cup, right? Got this at QuakeCon in the early 2000s when they just come out with their first GPUs and they were showing them off. And why did Jensen Huang create it? To play video games, right? And
Yeah.
now it runs AI. So there was a secondary use case that he never thought about. So much of everything was about video games, and because I knew how to do networking, eventually I met somebody who said you should get out of the business you're in because IT pays a lot more than what you're doing. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And then when I was doing IT, doing routing and switching and stuff. They said, we need somebody who wants to do the security stuff. And none of the guys who'd been around for a while wanted to because they all had CCIEs and I was still on my CCIE track. I hadn't gotten to that point. And I was kind of like, geez, do I really want to spend thousands of dollars on a CCIE lab? And so I said, I raised my hand. Yeah, I'll do network security. It was network security, and then it became the information security. Now it's cybersecurity. What's a cyber, and why are we securing it, right? But so I started basically installing IDSs and firewalls, early firewalls, and doing what we called pen testing. It's now cooler now. It's red teaming, but we called it pen testing back then. And vulnerability scans for PCI, and it was a QSA. And so all those things were great experiences that led up to being able to, build the foundations of the things that I saw were failures that when I was at Forrester, when I moved over there, I was actually allowed to do that research and come up with that because I don't think I would have ever been allowed to create zero trust if I was at a vendor or something else.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting opportunity. Like, how did that even come about where, zero trust was being thought of and you had the opportunity to do the research?
Well, I had a hatred with the trust model in firewalls for a long time, right? So if you remember firewalls, and I think it's still fairly true today, they have an internal interface called trusted and an external interface called untrusted. And you assign a trust level of 100 to the internal interface, and the external interface has a trust level of 0. And in the early versions of that, you didn't need a rule to go from a high trust level interface to a low trust level. So you didn't need a rule to go outbound of a network. And the DMZs all had to have a different trust level, 1 through 99, and they couldn't be the same and blah blah blah. But that was going to determine the policy. The idea was you wouldn't have to write these specific policies. It was going to make it easy. And I said, well, this is silly because as a pen tester, I've already gotten into your network, right? That's why I'm here. So I could easily exfil things because there's no outbound rules. So I started putting outbound rules on firewalls because I said all interfaces should have the same trust level, and that trust level is 0. That's where zero trust comes from. The trust level should be 0 on all interfaces. And there's no difference between an interface, right? You can't assign it something as undefinable as trust, which is a human emotion. And ultimately, I got a lot of people upset with me. The manufacturer of the firewalls got upset with me. The company I work for got upset because the company was complaining because the vendor was saying John shouldn't be doing this. He shouldn't be putting outbound rules on there. And so eventually my job got eliminated. We don't see a future in network security. And so my job got eliminated. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me, right? Because it started moving me in a different direction where I could learn more stuff. But I started studying trust. I met an academic that was his focus on the concepts of trust. And so that really influenced me a lot. And so I just said all interfaces have the same level of trust as 0. And this artificial trust model that somebody put into the world years ago is the problem because I remember saying to a CIO, "What's your cybersecurity strategy?" And he said, "This would verify." I said, "Oh, really? Why?" Well, because Ronald Reagan said so. And I'm thinking in my mind, yeah, that great cybersecurity guru, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan actually didn't say trust but verify. And my Russian isn't very good. I can never pronounce it. But he said dovernai no provernai, which literally translates into trust but verify, but it means we're never going to trust you. And he said this in his speech to Mikhail Gorbachev in the 80s. And so this guy said, well, because Ronald Reagan said so. And I said, oh, okay, well, I get it. Trust means you're not going to do anything to the packet. What are you doing to verify? Well, nothing. I'm not doing any verification because if I did that, they're trusted users. That would be rude. He actually said that would be rude. So he had taken his human emotions and he transferred it into the digital world. And that is one of the problems that we have, right? I just had this call about human versus machine identities. And I would argue that all identities are machine identities, right? John is not on the network right now. Joe is not on the network right now. There are packets that are asserted to come from us that assume that they are generated from a device that we are somehow controlling. But you and I are not on the network, right? We haven't shrunken down into subatomic particles and been sent over our personal wireless uh, networks and transferred to the, into the ISP, and then sent down a fiber optic cable to the Riverside server that we're talking on right now. That hasn't happened. So it's just kind of silliness, you know.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of viewing it. I mean, it's probably not that foreign, you know, from like back then. Now it's just like, man, yeah, people did actually have that mentality of, trust but verify. Like I've heard that before for sure, and it's like, yeah, that just like doesn't exist, like it doesn't exist in the framework or the mentality of a security professional, at least today. I hope it doesn't, at least.
Oh, there's still remnants around, and then you hear implicit trust versus explicit trust, and you're like, what? I mean, no, there's how much trust should there be in a system called zero trust?
Right, right.
It's a pretty simple question, but people are in love with this word trust, and they don't realize that you flip that coin over and it says betrayal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating because that's like the first thing that I learned was actually, zero trust. Just kind of understanding it inside and out, and really that like enabled me to kind of question things properly, right? Like within that framework, it enables me to actually have the right questions and say like, well, why are we just taking whatever this thing says as like fact, right? Like, well, what is there a trusted source, in this environment and whatnot? And it was interesting because I was working for a company, it's a really old company, and they had gotten breached. And so their like in-house, security architect that wasn't really a security architect, figured out or designed this essentially a zero trust environment for their, most valuable resources. And it was a very antiquated system by the time I got there. They designed it like with Microsoft's help and whatnot, so they paid an insane amount of money to do it. And by the time I got there, he was retiring, and it was like it looked like zero trust version .1 if I had to relate to it, right? Was because like it was so sequestered off. You would have thought that they had like top secret intelligence in there, some classified intelligence. And I'm sitting here like it's a public company. What are we like? We're not doing government work, like what is in this environment, and it was such a hassle to even update anything in that environment that it was very normal for, critical servers in that environment to be 2+ years behind on updates. And I'm just sitting here like, what are we doing? Like, this is not like I understand your logic behind it of making it that difficult, making it, more secure in your mind, right? Because it's more difficult to do things, but this doesn't make any sense in, 2017.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that and like, why is it 2 years behind? And it's because people are afraid, well, that might be a bad patch. So it's better not to patch it because things are still working. And then you look at things like the Sony PlayStation hack. They were I think they were 4 res behind in Apache. And everybody's like, well, it's working, so don't touch it. Right. Well, and then it quit working for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks because nobody could calculate that impact. The real impact that it actually has, human beings can't calculate that, because we always, what's the impact going to be? And that's not going to be very much. And then you look at JLG, and I don't know how many days they were down and couldn't make cars, and still aren't really rolling cars off the assembly line too quickly. And at the same time, had to have a huge cash infusion from the UK government because if they didn't, they would be out of business, right? They would have been hacked out of business. So, I think a lot of people are just too afraid of doing the right thing. And I tried to make zero trust simple enough in a way that you could deal with each protect surface on its own so that if you had a failure, it would only be to a very small part of the system, not everything going out.
Yeah. Yeah. That is very true. That's a great way of thinking about it too, right? And it's such a I feel like it's such a I don't know, like a common sense, thought or fundamental ideology for security now, right? That people don't even realize that it wasn't like that before, you know? Like the reason why that company was so far behind on their patches on their most critical resources was because it was actually so difficult to get in and actually do the patches. The team that was doing the patching, they would get in, they'd start the patching, and then their session would time out, and they'd have to go through this. I mean, it was literally like a 30-minute process to gain access to these resources. So then they have to log back in, monitor the patch, all this sort of stuff because it just wasn't automated, like even just logging in to check it was difficult. And so like literally like we had rogue IT deploying rogue, IT servers and stuff outside of this protected zero trust environment just so that they can operate the company,
Yeah, you saw
Like
that
that's
all the
just
time.
it's just like how crazy it was. And I mean, I remember sitting down with the security team and saying, okay, we have, CyberArk, what version are we on? Right. And they told me, oh, which instance of CyberArk, are you talking about? I said, we have multiple instances of CyberArk. And they said, oh, yeah, we have like five of them. I'm sitting here like, why do we have five? And they're like, well, we had to have one for this environment and one for this environment. And then it gets behind. And so we just decided to deploy another one, and we can't patch that one. So every couple of years, CyberArk makes another couple $1 million off of us because we have to like deploy new infrastructure. And I'm just sitting here like, oh my gosh, like what did I just get signed up for? Because I was like a week in.
Right.
I was like, oh God.
That would be frustrating, right? I mean, again, you see that kind of stuff happen, especially in where the teams don't communicate to each other,
Yeah.
right? So you have a lot of sometimes zero trust is the glue between teams because then they start talking to each other because they have to, and they go, "Oh." I had one guy say to me, "Boy, I really hate zero trust." I said, "I thought you liked you just told me a week ago that you really liked what you deployed." And he said, "Well, I do, but the problem that I have now is that if there's a problem on my side, there's so much transparency and visibility that I can't hide it anymore. And I can't blame somebody else. So everybody knows that there was a problem on my team and I just have to fix it." And he was joking around, right? But again, it was just, it had eliminated these conflicts between silos that were happening in a lot of these organizations. And that's one of the things that I saw as a big benefit was that people had to come together and actually talk and have conversations about what they were trying to do so that you could uncover those five versions of CyberArk and you could consolidate and you could do things. Because in reality, if you're doing zero trust correctly, no one should know that they're on a zero trust environment, right? They should all, Ed Snowden isn't going to call up the help desk and say, "Hey, I was in the middle of setting up these SSH tunnels to download sensitive documents to give to WikiLeaks, and I no longer have access. Can you provide?" He's not going to do that. So the only people who are going to know that are people who are A, either doing bad stuff, or B, you know, missed in the system, and they go, "Hey, I'm supposed to have access to this resource, but I don't now." And then their manager has to say, "Well, you really didn't need access to that," or say, "Okay, let's give you access." But it becomes very simple at that point. And we give too much access to too many people for no reason just because they've always had it. And that's the problem. So people get upset if they don't have access to something, but it's not something that they needed in the first place. So why? Why are you upset? You're not going to use it. I have very little access to things in my company because I don't need it. I need Word, I need PowerPoint, I need my Outlook, I need Slack, I need a few things. That's all I need. I don't need any access to any sensitive data anywhere in the company. And even when I do stuff for, say, government clients, I was once going through a getting my security clearance to do some work for the government, and it was very onerous. And I said to the person I was going through this with, I said, "Hold it, am I ever going to need access to your data to do this project?" He said, "No, you're never going to need access." And I said, "Then why am I going through this?" And he said, "Well, it's just something that people do." I said, "No, I'm going to withdraw from this process because this is a violation of the first principle of zero trust. Don't give people access to something that they don't need to do their job." And he said, "Well, getting a clearance is a badge of honor." And I said, "I don't want that badge of honor, right?" And he said, "You realize you're going to have to get escorted through these high security environments." And I said, "Sure, that's fine. That's how it should be, right? That's not an inconvenience to me. That's how it should be." And so when I go into some of these high security environments, sometimes there's actually a person with a pole that has a red flashing light. And as I walk through, they yell, "Unclear,
Yeah.
unclear," right? And I see people turning off their monitors. I've seen so many people turn off their monitors so I can't tell that they're playing solitaire, which is apparently the number one application in the US federal government. That's how it should be, right? And I love it because it's like being in a Monty Python movie. Bring out your dead. I'm not dead yet. I mean, yeah, that's how it should be. I shouldn't have access to any of that. I shouldn't need a clearance to do the high level abstracted work that I'm doing for you, right? I should be, if I'm in a high security clearance place, I should have somebody watching over me all the time. These are things that should happen, and it doesn't bother me in the least, and it bothers other people. And as they said, I think I just mentioned, it's a badge of honor, and to me, it's a badge of dishonor. I'd rather wear the scarlet A of access, right?
Hmm.
I have limited access, and my access should be strictly controlled based upon a need to know basis and strictly enforced. And don't give me access to something that I don't need, because all that can do is get you in trouble and me in trouble. That's all it can do.
Yeah, I remember when early on in my career when I was doing some work for the government, and I mean the lengths that they go to, and I look, it's not like I have access to anything, but like I can't even get logs from a device. Even, I have to look over someone's shoulder. The guy that, I'm telling the commands to doesn't even know Linux, for instance, and when I tell him, space, he actually types out the word space and not hitting space bar. So like I I understand both sides of it, right? Like, because I wanted the clearance at that point in my life. I wanted to go into like the federal government and everything. So if I got the clearance, it'd be a whole lot easier to do that, right?
And maybe you needed that to get your job done. See, that's the difference. I didn't need it to get my job done. You probably needed access to those logs to get your job done, so it would have made
Right.
sense to you, right?
I've had
So
to
that
fly across the country for logs just to look at some logs, and then I'm
yeah,
there for a week because once you're there, I don't want you to leave. I mean, like, it was crazy.
but there shouldn't be any proprietary data in a log,
Yeah.
right?
And there wasn't. There was never.
So
It was like literally an error code,
right,
like that's what I'm looking for. And then I have to leave the facility, call my dev directly, right? Say this is the error that I'm getting. And then he has to go figure out a fix. And hopefully it's a fix that I can make on site and not an update. Because if it's an update, that's like it's a whole other situation.
right, right. Well, and I think that, these are very complex systems, but we haven't really figured out how to properly document them.
Hmm.
And we haven't figured out how to industrialize IT the way we did other things. Recently, my daughter, she and her husband and my grandson live nearby, and their washing machine flooded. And I'm a pretty decent plumber, so I went over there with my plumbing toolkit. And what is the first thing I did? I looked up the model number. I found a manual, right? There was a manual, and it was printed out, and it said, if, here are, this is your symptom, water's coming from this place. Okay, here's what you do. 30 minutes later, it was fixed. I didn't even have to pull the dishwasher out. because there was a manual that said, here's a common thing that happens and here's what you do to fix it. But we don't document things like that. We keep it all in the heads of the guy who's about to retire, right? Which is why, you have like the COBOL Cowboys. I live in Texas, and out here in Wiley, Texas, there's a group of people called the COBOL Cowboys. You ever heard of them?
No, they're probably like the last 20 guys on the planet that know COBOL.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
actually know one of them. He's a family friend, and I was talking to him, and I was like, "COBOL? Like, I've never even heard of that." Because I met him, like, when I was first getting into IT,
yeah.
and he goes, "Yeah, it was a really old language, but I'm the only person at the company that knows it, and we're never getting rid of the mainframe, so my job is secure forever."
It is, and these guys get called up, and they work 2 or 3 weeks a year, and they make $1,000,000. They can ask for whatever they want because there's nobody who does it. And I tell young people all the time, if you want a secure job, learn COBOL. Because, I mean, pretty soon everybody who knows COBOL is going to be either in a grave or, in some sort of suspended animation in the basement of companies, and they're going to have to go do the Dr. Frankenstein thing to wake them up or something because, it's just a lost art and it's just a language, right? But we don't teach it because, oh, it's old, it's decremented, no one uses it except, 90 some percent of financial transactions are done on mainframes. IBM's mainframe business grew year over year last year. They're not going away.
That's crazy. I didn't even know that was a stat. Like, I worked for a credit bureau, and we had a mainframe, and I mean, the thing was giant. We had like basically we had several data centers within the building that we were in. And I mean, the one with the mainframe, it basically took up the whole floor. That was the only thing that was in there, except for maybe a few other server racks, but that was it.
You should see them now. I mean, IBM has them. I went to a bank. They just replaced their mainframes and put in two in HA mode, and they're 2 rack units each, equal to what used to be a tower,
Wow.
right? And so you're actually seeing kind of a resurgence of mainframe. And mainframes run AI really well too, right? So, everybody talks about that as legacy. And I was doing a panel discussion once a number of years ago. We were talking about this question, and we came to the conclusion, it's not legacy if it's making you money. And I was talking to the CTO of one of the world's largest banks about his mainframe. And he said that, the dev guys are always trying to get me to move it to the cloud. And so I said, okay, put together a proposal on how we do that. And they did. They knew how to do it. And what was the price tag? Well, let's just say it was $1 billion. And I asked him, well, how am I going to make that $1 billion back plus another extra $1 billion to make it worth my while? Well, you're not. You have plenty of money. You're a bank. Well, it makes no financial sense for me to ever spend that $1 billion. That's $1 billion in wasted cost when I've got something that works really, really well. It's really efficient, and it's got a lot of built-in security controls, RBAC and all that kind of stuff. And so, why would I ever do that? And they couldn't answer that. It was just because it's not cool to have a mainframe. It's cool to be in the cloud,
Yeah.
and that's not the right answer from a business perspective.
Hmm. That's really interesting, because I, I usually I usually recommend to people that when they're getting into the field, think of it in terms of like, hey, what is coming? Start specializing in that, start focusing on that and learning it and whatnot to kind of future proof your career to some extent. I mean, you're never going to be like fully future proof or anything like that, right? But it at least gives you a leg up against the people that are working on a deprecated technology that no longer, runs everywhere, right? But in this case, we're actually talking about going backwards and learning a technology that is still prevalent in an industry that, maybe you want to work in that industry, but it's an industry that historically, I mean, you get in and you stay within it, forever, right? Like I can't even tell you how many companies I've been at that are in the finance industry where, when you go and talk to another finance company, they literally say on there, we want someone with finance experience. And I'm just used to dealing with stock traders and portfolio managers and, all these people that are dealing with these like high frequency trading and everything. Like I'm used to dealing with that because my entire career has like been in that industry. it's a fascinating way of looking at it. I never even thought of, looking at mainframes as something to like even pick up.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things when you're in that industry, you're not in milliseconds, you're in microseconds,
Oh
right?
yeah, nanoseconds. Yeah,
Right, you're like and a lot of, the cloud can't do that, right? The cloud can never do that. There's going to be latency that's injected into the system, so you want that, mainframe as close to Wall Street as you possibly can, and mainframes are really good at that, and they still do a lot of that work, and it's because they do it really fast, really efficiently, and they're very stable, right? So, you know, I would it would be interesting if we could get somebody like at a university to teach somebody COBOL versus, Rust or some of the new languages or the AI vibe coding, and then see in like 2 years their salaries.
yeah,
You know,
that would
that
be
would be a,
fascinating.
that would be a fascinating case study for somebody, because I'll bet that if somebody came out and they really understood COBOL, for example, they would find that there was an unlimited opportunities for you, because it's rarity that is the thing that accelerates a career, not overabundance. There's going to be a bazillion vibe coders who know how to use Claude code, right? Everybody and their dog is doing that now, and but the number of professional COBOL coders on a couple of hands probably, and they're going to be needed.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And you bring up a really valid point, because whenever I get any sort of, education, whether it's a certification or I'm studying, something in my free time, which I don't have very much of anymore, but hopefully when I'm done with this research, I'll have more time to dive into these topics. There's two ways of approaching it, right? Because I talked to someone previously, maybe 2, 3 years ago at this point, and he had like every cert under the sun, right? Not really specialized in anything necessarily, but he had just about every cloud cert that you could possibly have. AWS, Azure, GCP, all that sort of stuff. And I always recommend that people, choose an area and go deep into that area, right? Like learn it as best as you possibly can, because that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. It's one thing to check a box for HR, but it's another for you to actually understand it, at length of what are trying to accomplish and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to be sort of a generalist now. And if you're in the cloud world, you have to know how to use multi-cloud systems. And there's so many of them, and they all kind of work differently, but they all kind of work the same. And then there's different things, different. So, and then, programmatically, there's probably going to be a lot of systems that are going to control those things externally and blah, blah, blah. But again, if everybody's doing the same thing, it diminishes the rarity, right? Gold is valuable because it's rare and there's no more being made, right? And so rarity is, if you can get yourself injected into a rarity system, which I don't even know if that's a thing, but I just coined a new word, but a rarity system, then yeah, I mean, Bitcoin has value because there's a limit to how many bitcoins can ever be mined. If there was an unlimited number of bitcoins that could be mined, they wouldn't have any value.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Where do you see just the tech industry overall going? I asked this question almost hesitating, right? Because no one really knows exactly where it's going, but there's also reports that, OpenAI is kind of maxing out on their capability, right? They're reaching a peak to their own capability, and it's quicker than what they expected, quicker than what anyone else expected, right? Or that the new NVIDIA GPUs are not performing as they would have expected or wanted or whatever it might be. So we're already seeming to like run into those issues. And I mean, everyone knows it looks like a bubble at this point, right? Like all that they need is to like basically finally cap out at their capability, and everything kind of comes crumbling down to some extent. Where where would you recommend that people focus going forward.
I mean, you kind of have to swim with the trends a little bit, swim with the current, follow where the VCs are putting money into it, because everything that we do is determined by venture capital and private equity firms. There's no more pure research anymore. There's no Bell, AT&T, Bell Labs, where people just create things for no reason, right? And then it turns out that they were useful. Or there's no more innovation like that. There's no more Xerox PARC. Everybody wants a return on investment very, very quickly in that VC world, and sometimes that doesn't happen. So one of the great examples is your iPhone, right? The iPhone has Gorilla Glass in it, made by Corning. Corning invented Gorilla Glass in 1966, thinking it would make a great windshield. And it did. It was very resistant to breaking, but when it did break, it sent dangerous knife sharp edges of glass into your body. So they didn't have a market for it. Steve Jobs called up in 2006, 2007, hey, I need a much better glass that's resistant to breakage. Have we got something for you? We've had it hanging around here since 1966, and now here's the but who's doing that anymore? Who would hold on to something for that long?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the problem. I mean, you look at the history of Unix, right? Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson were at Bell Labs, wanted to create a video game. No one would give them time on the Cray mainframe. They said, oh, there's an old PDP in the corner. They turned it on. There was no operating system. They had to write an operating system for it. That became Unix, which became Linux, which runs the cloud. But if they didn't want to, create a video game and there wasn't a place to just experiment with video game technologies, we'd never have Unix or Linux or the cloud. So there's a lot of things that are sort of accidental in the history of this business. And I don't think you can be purposeful and say, you know, we need an ROI in 18 months. I mean, it's just, that was, I don't know what year they did that. I heard this story from one of their colleagues at Bell Labs. Fascinating story because I didn't know it. I mean, I knew that they had created it, but I didn't know they had created it accidentally because they were trying to do something else, and they never made the video game, right? And it kind of goes back to that theme that a lot of things in cybersecurity and in IT, were driven by video games. I don't know where it's all going. I mean, a lot of the things that VCs are pushing for people to buy are not particularly useful. They give people a lot of noise, but not a lot of signal, and people don't know what to do with it. But they think they need to have it, right? So you get a lot of DR things, something DR. Everybody puts a DR at the end of it, and that's just here's all the telemetry. It's kind of like what in Schneier's book Secrets and Lies, he quotes Marcus Raynham, and this is going to be a very, very rough quote of that off the top of my head. But Raynham said, IDS is like somebody walking up to you on a battlefield and going, hey, that's a horrible sucking chest wound. I hope somebody takes a look at that for you. Versus a firewall is you get to wear some body armor, right? And that's a true statement. And but we have a lot of technology that is just more of that's a horrible sucking chest wound. That's a horrible sucking chest wound. That's a horrible sucking chest wound. And that's not very useful to know that you have horrible sucking chest wounds. What do I do with all this telemetry that you've given me? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you've
Yeah.
looked at enough logs to know that a lot of times you don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to start like go investigating it, asking around a little bit, you know?
I once when I was covering SIM at Forrester, which is what we called it at the time, we refused to talk about CM, because we thought, in our view, information and events were the same thing, and it was just confusing the market. But when I was covering SIM, I was talking to a CIO about his SIM product, and he said, it's a little bit like reading tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. I know it's supposed to tell me something, but I have no idea what it is. And I said, so if you had to do it over again, you wouldn't buy it? And he said, no, I would absolutely buy it because if I don't have it, it looks like I'm not a mature organization, right? So, PCI requirement, was it 10, I think? I don't remember, but the one for log management was the thing that saved the sim business because I was trying to sell it in resellers at the time and you couldn't sell it. And PCI came out and said you need to do log management. They never said you needed a sim. They said you needed to collect logs and you needed to look at them once a day. But the vendors picked that up and said, well, you need a sim, which wasn't true. Right. And so now you had a lot of movement in the sim business and it just gave people a lot of tea leaves that they didn't know what to do with. Right. They weren't that good of fortune tellers. And it's kind of, it was the full employment act for the sim business in some ways.
That's interesting. I didn't even realize that. But every single SIM product has log management in the description of the product, probably for that exact reason.
Yes, absolutely. Because one of the requirements I want to say is 10, but it's been so long since I've looked at that. I mean, I'm a former QSA, so I used to have every requirement memorized, but that's been a long time ago. But yeah, and I remember my first day of training at Visa's headquarters, Visa's technical headquarters in Foster City. This CISO of Visa came out and said, "We put that in not for you, not for the client, but for us. Because if there's a credit card breach, we need to know what happened. And we're going into all these places where there's been credit card breaches and there's no logs and we don't have any idea what happened. So we did that for us, not for, your client that you're going to be doing the assessment for. You're going to be validating the assessment, whatever it is. And so it was kind of a eye-opening experience when he said, "That's not for the end users. That's for us. So we know why it happened, right? And maybe they'll get some value of it, but it's really hard for them to operationalize that kind of stuff."
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, John, we're unfortunately at the top of our time. I had a fascinating conversation. It was fantastic having you on. I really do appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, anytime. Let me know, Joe, and good luck on your dissertation. I can't imagine the psychic pain that you're going through right now, but you know, send me a copy when it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I absolutely will. Well, John, before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they could find you if they wanted to connect and maybe learn some more?
Yeah, easiest place is LinkedIn. That's the place I spend. That's probably the only social media I really use anymore. So I post things, for the work I'm doing at Illumio or stuff on Zero Trust over there, and I get a couple of hundred LinkedIn connection requests a, a week. So if I don't get to yours right away, I apologize. I'm just trying to get through it all, and get a few at a time and then go back to work. So, but that's the place I'm most visible at. And then you can go to Lumio.com and search for our Zero Trust Hub. And a lot of the blog posts and things that I write are on our Zero Trust Hub over at Lumio.com.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the links to all of that in the description of this episode. And thanks everyone for joining us. I know that we had some live viewers this time. So hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to the next one. Bye, everyone.